The psychology of secrecy. What are the effects that it has on people? Well, I think that, for one, and we can observe this when it comes to the history of the intelligence community, people who are engaged in this kind of cloak and dagger stuff and leading double lives and having secrets they can never even speak a word about to their wives or to their children, they not only are they fragmented individuals in a very basic sense, but they will then identify more with other fragmented individuals than everyday people. This is perhaps why, when you look at the spy lore from decades ago, you find account after account where, the CIA is actually helping the KGB, or the KGB is helping the CIA. That at the level of these guys, they regarded each other as colleagues, professionals, even though they might be opposed here and there tactically and so on. They had this respect for each other. They had more kinship with each other as intelligence professionals, spies, than with the people of their own countries. So that tells you one thing. Now, when it comes to the cooperation between nations, I think, I at least have suspected for a long time, that the only reason why you have the so-called special relationship between the US and the UK at bottom is the UFO issue. Sure, you can point to the obvious historical consequences of World War II, the way the US took on, the UK's empire and perpetuated many of the same policies and so on and so forth. But I think when you really get down to the concrete foundation of it, there's this dark, titillating, mysterious set of secrets that they both in some way share. And when you expand that to the so-called Five Eyes countries, I think, what is it, South Africa, New Zealand, and
Australia,
Australia,
yeah,
in addition to the
Canada.
UK and the US. Sure, they're English speaking, and therefore there's a certain cultural similarity that is achieved. But I think again, it's the UFO issue. In the supposed Temple of Jerusalem, there was the Holy of Holies, which is this room that no one was ever allowed to go into. And in a lot of Hitchcock's films, there's a so-called MacGuffin, which is something which sets everything into motion, but the thing itself is irrelevant to the movie. Sometimes you don't even find out what it is. So the idea that you can have this central lack, this absence or a suppression of something, which is at the heart of the entire machine, the entire operation, maybe even the entire civilization, ought to be a commonplace today, but it isn't. I mean, many cultures are sustained through the repression of certain truths. It's on the basis of the repression of those truths that everything else becomes structured and is able to operate. I suspect that the ultimate secrets that the US government or whatever's inside of it has, relate to the UFO issue, and to the extent that there's a recognition of that between certain countries, they are all intertwined and they're all structured around that lack, that suppression. So it gives them an impetus to all other kinds of secrecy. And again, you have to consider that they consider themselves aligned against an outside threat. And unknown is always a threat to most people, especially these people, and a threat is something you have to fight against. So they have this suppression of details, of facts, of truths. That suppression structures the rest of the environment, the political environment, and these countries cooperate to that extent. And I think to some extent it's even the case between countries like the US and Russia. I mean, the Soviet Union ended. Was there disclosure? Did all of the KGB's UFO secrets come out? Never happened.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, and you pointed something I can't quite understand is that the US, of course, is not alone in the world. I've never understood why, say, the likes of China and India, the Chinese and Indian governments have not pushed very openly for disclosure. If Greer is right in his assessment that at the heart of the secrecy lies some exotic new physics, which would give rise to, uh, a free and a painless, seamless energy generation. If that is the case, then one would expect the demographically strong but geopolitically weak countries to lead the charge in any disclosure movement. But we don't see that at all.
Well, you're
Instead,
right. Yeah.
that seems strange. Like, why hasn't Putin, or why don't the Russians and the Chinese embarrass the American government in some ways, or they themselves? What does the Chinese government declare? Yeah, look, we saw these things, and we're an intelligent nation. We know what we saw, but it doesn't happen. And then you get these some very very interesting moments. For example, some years ago, you had it was Medvedev, the prime minister, who was caught the then president, when he was still serving as president, the satellite feed from the studio continued running as he went into what he thought was an off-the-record conversation with two journalists. And they asked him, one of them asked, like, is there anything to this UFO story? He says, yeah, there is. And he said, when you become president, you get two files. I think this is how the story went, two files. One is the nuclear codes. The other is a report from this most secret intelligence agency that manages the extraterrestrial subject and primarily concerns itself with the presence of extraterrestrials on Earth. This came out. This was on the satellite feed, and
I remember. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe they have the reasons for. Well, obviously they have particular reasons for not saying anything, but I wonder how there could be a commonality of purpose across so many agencies when you have lives which are still ultimately situated outside their professional institutional settings. So it's an excellent point you make about these spies, but and the fact that they can recognize in each other, or at least feel in each other, certain psychological dispositions, which leaves them innately sympathetic to one another. That they are, as you mentioned earlier on, in this linguistic sense, they are very much insiders. But still, you'd have to think that their position in a Beijing suburb with a family and friends and the like outweighs that in consideration of the national interest. That you would expect that there would be some significant breakup or break in the secret government along, from particular national vectors. But you don't see it.
Well, I think I can account for that, at least to take a crack at it, with overlapping reasons why. Now, in response to what you just said, one could equally say that you could expect that people in law enforcement would behave in the national interest and not gun down civilians. But we see that happening every day in the U.S. And I think in the end, the reason is because each human being, as primitive and silly as it may be, is on his or her own life's adventure, even when that carries them into infamy. And what they're really concerned with is their life's adventure. Now, if you are someone in intelligence work who has spent your life living double, triple lives, and you have these secrets that no one will ever know, that is more who you are than any family, friends, barbecues. That's who you are, because that's really where your interests are. I mean, that's your thrill, that's your adventure. So in the end, I don't think any of them would sacrifice their inner experience, which is connected to their way of life. That way of life becomes a deep inner experience, because when you have to maintain such a complete level of secrecy and know things that you yourself only know, so on and so forth, it's almost mystical, I think. So they would never get rid of it. In just the same way, to a much lesser degree, people in law enforcement would never get rid of police, even though the institutions might be corrupt and innocent civilians getting killed every day. That's their way of life. That's who they are, so they would never change it. Now, in a similar way, when you start to look at people in governments, I think at the highest levels of power, there is also this, for lack of a better term, mystical type experience. Because when you are at any kind of level of power, in my view, you operate in an environment of total paranoia. But your paranoia can never be whispered to anyone because then you'll be seen as paranoid. The fact is, if you are in the US Congress or you're in the federal agencies and so on, it has to become immediately apparent that it's a war of all against all. Everyone's stabbing each other in the back all the time. People want higher positions. People want to frame other people for crimes that they themselves have committed. People want to cover up their own activities to avoid prosecution. Everyone has constantly got the knives out against everyone. And awareness of that fact, which is undeniable, can only produce a state of total paranoia. But you also can never outwardly behave that way because then you're paranoid, you're unstable. So it's this unspeakable truth that everyone knows is true, but no one will ever utter a word about. This is the nature of power. This is why no one in the official world will ever concede that somebody was assassinated by conspiracy. I mean, all across the spectrum, that just this denial, it's almost a psychological denial on their part, because if they admit that, someone was probably assassinated in some sort of state-sponsored operation, that opens the door. It suggests that all of these things can happen, and you have to deny them all or none. You have to deny none of them or all of them, because that's how it is. So they deny all of them. And you see this in interviews with politicians when you corner them and you get to the point where there's this obvious, vast conspiracy of people who mean to do harm on some particular issue in some particular way. And you can get that politician right to the point of admitting it, but they won't say. They'll just give you the little look. And what I think you're seeing at that moment is you're seeing into their inner experience because they too, like the intelligence operatives, live a kind of double life. When you go to that level of power, you see the unimaginable corruption that no one else can even guess at. And you enter into that state of total paranoia. You can never communicate it to anybody. You simply can't. Now, if we take it as a given that this is so, and that it's a kind of universal phenomenon, I see it operating equally in China, in Russia, in the US, in France. Once you reach a certain level of power, you can be gotten at from any possible direction. You can be assassinated. You can be discredited. You can be framed. You can be blackmailed. It happens all the time to everyone. When you catch wind of it, you know it can happen to you. You live in a state of total paranoia. So they're all totally paranoid. This is their primary mode, the people in power, in every national government. Well, given that disposition, how would you react to the UFO issue and to the idea of disclosure? Well, I suggest that you would react with even more paranoia. You would never, even if you're India, you're the government of India, you would never come out and say that UFOs are real, and we know for a fact that the U.S. government has the technology, and we're going to have this big national movement. We're going to try to get the technology released because you're absolutely paranoid of what might happen. It's totally unpredictable. Assassination is just one scenario of many.
Yeah.
So when you're in a state of total paranoia, your default position is to do nothing.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. There's also something else, that needs to be taken into account is that even within China, India, Russia, I'm sure there are agencies and groups which deal with this subject are fragmented too. So you have one group centered around the army that have one part of the story. You have other groups in the Air Force and Navy, intelligence people, they have control of different aspects of it. So that then means that one group, no group in particular, will have any incentive to come forward to try and press what they know into the public realm, because then they would immediately lose control of that. And they would fear that in that process of disclosing what they know, while other groups would circle around and take that from them.
Yeah. Well, it's a lost cause when you consider also that it takes a certain level of intelligence to even be able to entertain the possibility of this stuff being real to begin with. How many officials, even high power, whether it's the public face of the government or deep down in the government, how many people have the intelligence to be able to even intellectually engage with it to begin with? So there again, you cut the numbers. I mean, you'd
Yeah.
have to have people who, the only reason to bring it forward would be out of pure idealistic principle. And the people who get to positions of power are not the people who are capable of that kind of idealistic principle. They're people who have spent their lives engaged in total secrecy, practically schizophrenic, multiple lives, whether they're politicians in a state of paranoia that they can never really express, or the intelligence operatives. These are people who only achieve those positions because they're never motivated by principle. So you would have to have people who are motivated by principle, which is an impossibility, and have the intelligence to even try to engage with the issue to begin with. I'm sure there have been CIA directors who've known about the UFO issue more than others, some who know nothing about it at all. There's
Yeah.
variation depending on the individual. And the same for the lower levels of power. Somebody who might have potentially a means to get at some of the secrets and do something about it would first have to have the intelligence to make it part of their world, and then also be motivated by principle to the extent that they're willing to do it. So what are the chances of that?
Well, when you frame it like that, well, there's not going to be very many. It's I can think of one offhand was according to Greer, I think it was William Colby had been so motivated, and for his trouble, he was apparently assassinated. He died when he was canoeing. And according to Greer, he was about to release. He had access to particular monies and particular secrets when they were to be released, and that never happened. I suppose when I look at this issue of disclosure from, say, just looking at the Chinese government perspective, if they find that if they looked at something like what Greer reports, that there is this issue of energy generation on its heart, you would think it doesn't require an enormous amount of intelligence among the people who rule China to recognize that there is such a thing as the American secret government. In our supposed democracies, it's a ridiculous idea. For a Chinese communist official, it's probably a more natural way to think of things, that America is home to vast conspiracies. Maybe they're culturally more, you'd have to think they're more predisposed to seeing American governance for what it is. On top of that, then they can maybe more easily accept or readily accept that there are secrets there. And I think the idea that energy generation may lay at its heart is a simple enough point that they can link that to the Chinese self-interest quite quickly and easily. But we don't, again, to come back to what I said, is we just don't see that happening. I know what you're saying is that, yeah, they mightn't have the intelligence to see this or to maybe grasp this subject. But if they're general of, the National Intelligence Agency, whatever it is, when he's given their leadership a rundown on the American defense budget, where the money goes, they're not going to say, well, hang on a minute, are you trying to really tell me there's a whole secret defense department? They're going to go, of course there is. Yeah, of course there's a secret. So what are those secrets? And then they sort of start speaking of them. I'm not sure if really that speaks against your points in any particular way, but I just have this image in mind. I know that the Chinese Communist leadership did this great collective meeting, I think it's once every couple of years in some resort, where they bring in their top couple of thousand officials, and they basically sit in conference halls and they go through, the major sort of policies and issues they have to face. America has to be on their mind. And amongst that collective, when they sit there thinking, they must understand. They would completely accept there's a large hidden government. But what is it they want would have to be on their mind. And where does the money go? Where does the power actually lie in the United States?
Well, I suspect they already basically know.
Yeah.
I mean, they all know, my sense is they all kind of know what the other's doing. If this supposed feud between Russia and the US at present were really true, if somebody like Russia or China really felt an imminent danger from the U.S., one of the best ways to hit at the U.S. and to damage American power would be to hit them from the UFO issue.
Oh
I mean,
yeah,
if Russian intelligence had some sort of undeniable proof of UFO cover-up in the U.S. and so on, the whole world would turn on the U.S. in an instant, I think, if it were done in a particular way. But you
yeah,
don't see Russia doing that. When you
no,
talk about the national interest, I think really that you have to also ask the question, to whom does this concept of national interest belong? I think only middle class people. I don't think this notion of the national interest exists. I mean, the governments of the world are populated by scoundrels, and they don't think in those terms. I mean, they'll respond to an imminent danger to something within their territory for other reasons, but you don't see them really undertaking anything for the national interest. If the national interest is served, it's always by accident. If they undertake a building project, it'll be because X, Y, and Z need to get rich. And if the country benefits, fine. But if the project turns out to be a disaster, like, these ghost cities full of skyscrapers that were unnecessary or a bridge to nowhere, well, that happens all the time in government too. I don't see much evidence that anybody is compelled by the concept of the national interest. And even if you've got one person, it'll be one person here and then,
mm.
1,000 miles to the next person who has the same concept in government, and they never form any kind of force. They don't drive any kind of policy. Likewise, if you're the government of India, even though your burgeoning population might be served by free energy and you could lift 1 billion people out of poverty overnight, who gives a shit? They're not going to do it. I mean, they're going to do things their way, the scoundrel way.
Yeah, but even scoundrels wish to survive. Like the Chinese Communist Party, it owes its legitimacy to ever-rising standards of living. The day, in any authoritarian regime, the day the ambitions of its rising middle class are thwarted, it's the day the revolution begins.
Oh,
And
no,
for the
I'm not sure that's true. I mean, look at the U.S. today. There's ample reason for the government to be overthrown and absolutely no desire to do so. And you also have Latin American countries where you've had
yeah,
this or that totally failed government in place for decades. Then there's no means, there's no way to overthrow them. Governments survive all the time with zero legitimacy.
well, I mean, America is supposedly a democracy, and its people think of it as such. Most do. Um, you're the Americans. Just correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think too many Americans would on its face recognize the American government as authoritarian.
No, they don't. But see, that's another way of saying the same thing. If you have some means of keeping your populace from overthrowing you when you have zero legitimacy, and you find the means, then you're not overthrown. And it seems like more often than not,
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
governments can
All
pull
right.
that off today.
Okay. Well, I'll just then more narrowly say that with China, I mean, you have the Chinese Communist Party. It is, it avoided the fate of other communist parties suffered in the early 90s by, I think it's fair to say, they've succeeded in generating, modernizing China and delivering ever higher standards of living. But that continued success it's really dependent on American controlled supply lines. They know this. I mean, that's the whole point of the U.S. Navy. It's the whole point of American Middle Eastern policy. One of the points really is control the flow of oil into the world. And right now, I mean, that's China's lifeblood, and that lifeblood is really it's within the gift of the U.S. Now, whereas I mean, the governments, may fundamentally be criminal and self-interested in and of themselves, still operate within a hierarchical world system where the hierarchy, or at least the upper parts of it, wish to preserve themselves. And the U.S. government is that upper part of that hierarchy, and I think it will move to thwart threats, challenges to its position. I think it in part explains its response to China and Russia. But China itself, the Chinese Communist Party, it must continue its rise within that hierarchy. It must continue pursuing its destiny, of which threatens to supplant the United States' position in the world. Now that can happen alongside that Chinese Communist Party, acting criminally and serving its own, narrow, selfish interests. But what I'm saying is that for that process to continue, then I think very naturally they will have to take into account, the issue of energy generation and energy supply. In a way, you think might force the hand a bit more of disclosure. But having said that, I mean, I can sort of correct my own analysis and say, well, it hasn't happened yet. So why expect it in the future?
Yeah. You can imagine scenarios in which public pressure of a very acute sort causes a change in the way governments are handling the UFO issue and suppressed technology. You can also imagine scenarios in which the public can exert no effective pressure on the issue, and it'll depend on the facts at hand, what actually happens. I do agree with you in the special case of China that the middle class at the moment is much more jealous of its prosperity and much more quick to anger when it comes to its officials than the U.S. today. You hear news stories about, riots over public corruption, and even, for Christ's sake, political officials will be beheaded or executed or whatever because of, illegalities. When it comes to the public at the moment, I think it's probably true, and this may be where you're coming from, that the Chinese people, because they've had this explosion of prosperity, they're not complacent. They seem to be the opposite. They want shit to be done right. Now, whether 20 or 30 years from now that produces disclosure, who knows? We know that it's not necessarily a straight line, linear passage, though, from now, A, to B, then.
Yeah.
Because publics can be thwarted, they can be divided, they can be controlled. It's done all the time. It's done in the U.S., it's done everywhere. And I mean, there could be a set of circumstances that brings it about. But likewise, it could go on just as it is.
Yeah, I think too, on reflection, when you think about the Chinese and you said the Chinese and the Russians, I mean, it's not with the Chinese Communist Party, but people who are skeptical of China's modernization say it can't be sustained because of the sheer amount of distortion in the process that's been present. And they point to the fact is the senior Chinese Communist Party officials, their first order of business is to secure a foreign passport for their children, is to get them into an American or a Canadian or Australian university, buy that property overseas. It's known for a fact here in Australia that if they lifted restrictions overnight, it would be an unlimited amount of Chinese investment in Australian real estate. As it stands, I mean, overseas Chinese they're single-handedly the drivers of current property prices in Sydney and Melbourne. And the point being that to take, the United States, when it was rising to power, its elite weren't looking to abandon the country. They were not looking to abandon America. Whereas that's happening with China. And, equally, you can see the same with Russia. I mean, the sanctions imposed were, well, Russia itself currently, I mean, for all Putin's success in modernizing Russia, he just simply deepened and widened the oligarchy. Rather than 10 or 15 men, it's now apparently really 15, 1,000 or 1,000, 1,500 families, and they are, of course, in a similar fashion or to the Chinese, they're invested overseas. Their children go to school in England, the money's in Switzerland, then they go to university in the United States, and so on and so forth. So they're no more committed to Russia than the Chinese leadership are committed to China. You couple that then with the likely intelligence capabilities of, say, the secret government, which is largely centered in the US. Stephen Greer talks about at one point he makes a contact And he asked, well, how am I going to get in touch with you at a later stage? And the guy says, just talk in your room. He says, what do you mean just talk? He says, just talk out loud. We can hear you. We'll pick it up. And you have to think in the same way, you know, coming back to the point I've made before, is that with the computing power you assume NSA have and the intelligence capabilities and all these exotic nonlinear technologies, that surely to God they can pick up when some Chinese official says to the other, you know what? And then these people are approached. Again, with some, you know, psychological sophistication and saying, look, here's what's actually going on. Moreover, here's $50 million and a green card. So there's corruption and there's corruption. You think really, when you talk about that, it's like, how much would it take to do that? 1 unit, 10 men. Your job is to keep an eye on the Chinese and the Russians. You work 9 to 5. How hard can it be? What is the Chinese and Russian leadership? A few hundred people. It's like a headmaster running a medium-sized school. You know what I mean?
There you go. There you go.
Yeah.
But consider that this fact is probably known to basically anybody in power with any intelligence, that anything you say can be monitored at any time, that you're probably being observed in ways that you don't understand and can't anticipate, that you could be assassinated for obscure reasons. All of these things, they feed back into what I was trying to get at before, with the basic fundamental approach to the world being that of paranoia when it comes to these people in power. People in NSA who are totally surveilling everything all the time, when they consider extraterrestrials perhaps doing the same or worse, imagine what they imagine. Well, you take what they know about what can be accomplished and then feed into that their worst fears.
Oh, right. Yeah. Well, but then you're coming up against, even within the secret government, is they would have to assume that extraterrestrial surveillance and manipulation is a couple of degrees notched up. So
exactly.
then you know, you take it even from that perspective of our putative Chinese officials knocking on us back and forth over a couple of beers and a bowl of noodles in some canteen of some ministry in Beijing. Then there is no legitimacy in any system for any of the players. So you find yourself, you know, you're the British Prime Minister, and you find that there is a secret government, and they don't actually know what they're doing. And then there's an actual government. The people who do have power over the world, they're not even here. So in that context, if you're just dealing with these sort of endless shadow games, whatever integrity you have as a public official has to suffer. And so then you arrive at a point. I think it was Paul Craig Roberts made it. He once asked some senior official within the CIA, he said, how is it we control Europe? How do we control Britain and France and Germany and Italy? He said, easy, money. We just buy them off. And there was something here, I looked at that and I smiled, and then I saw, just right today, Tony Blair, in his first 12 months out of office, he made £50 million.
Yeah, I think I read the same thing. I follow the Paul Craig Roberts site pretty closely. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, and what's Tony Blair? He's basically a second-rate barrister. You know, he's just 50 in 12 months, 50 million. So he probably sits there. He's, you know, this sea of confusion, and no one's sure what the hell is going on in any particular direction. And they basically say, "Fuck it." You know, really, they just say, "Okay, well, sure."
Yeah. Well, consider the story about the Lawrence Rockefeller visit with the Clintons. That seems to have some basis in fact. You know, he was a UFO enthusiast and gave a lot of money to different efforts, wanted to discuss it with the Clintons. And at some point, Hillary took him aside and told him, you know, very quietly, you know, Bill doesn't want to discuss this, or we don't want to discuss this, something along those lines. The way it was executed was really interesting, in that you have someone telling you firmly and forcefully that they don't even want to discuss it. Now, if talk is simply talk, and you're dealing with like a multimillionaire who can donate tons of money to your campaign, and he wants to chew your ear off for an hour about UFOs, under ordinary circumstances, one would think one would do so. Just let him talk. What's the harm? But no, she takes him aside separately and says, this is not going to be discussed. Why? Well,
Yeah.
because these people, even in the 90s, knew they were part of that system and total paranoia, and they know what the real possibilities are. That everything that's said can be monitored and someone can be assassinated on the basis of the sheer fact that they say the wrong thing. Maybe they demonstrate an interest. Maybe they suggest some sort of knowledge which they may or may not have. So you don't even discuss it. And that, I think, that mindset is rampant. And when you get to the people in the NSA and so on who are trying to anticipate what extraterrestrials are doing, the paranoia must be maddening. And I think that informs these so-called my lab experiences that you hear about, which are basically brutal. The people are treated like they're the enemy. And when you hear about the harassment of people who have had UFO sightings and abductions, what is the point of that? I mean, if you have these people, soldiers or intelligence operatives who are Americans, for example, they feel a kinship with other Americans, they wouldn't engage in this kind of unambiguously hostile treatment. But from their point of view, anybody who in any way has contact with these extraterrestrials, outsiders, could potentially be like a Manchurian candidate, somebody who is an agent for them, someone who's under their control, an infiltrator. So they're going to treat anybody who's had direct contact with this as enemies.
Right. Well, yeah, and then this is the other, well, not another. This is, another question is, what is the secret government's view of the extraterrestrials? What conclusions have they come to? I remember Timothy Good. He tells a story. I think it's Ramirez, one of these contactees, Latin American, and anyway, this I think it's Venezuelan. After his contacts, which were quite extensive. Now, I'm confused amongst a number of cases, but I think this is the one where he met a man he took to be a Swiss. And the Swiss was no such thing. Long story short, contacts, so on and so forth, sightings in a group, blah, blah, blah. He got brought over to the US. He got asked. He wasn't like kidnapped. It's nothing nefarious. He said, please come over. He gets taken to some house with a couple of doctors. And one of them is Spanish speaking, and he's in some house. And the library full of UFO materials, one thing you remember. And they basically tell him, look, we want to just administer a number of tests and just check a few things. Anyway, they did so, and one thing they did tell him is that they thought they were quite sure that the extraterrestrials were engaged in psychological warfare with humanity, which is to say that their truth and falsehood are instrumental towards some hidden manipulative purpose. Now, if you step back from that, you get a broader sort of feel for this, or this is just one report amongst dozens or even hundreds, where you're dealing with an intelligence which is in no way honest with us, which are serving purposes, as several people have reported, that are difficult, if not impossible, to actually identify, then almost as a result of the precautionary principle, you would start taking defensive action against them in whatever form that may take. And this is something when you look at it, these supposed shoot downs and takedowns of UFOs that have occurred. Like on one hand, you think, gee, how could they do such a thing to these poor, harmless beings from another world? Then if you enter in a situation where you actually begin to sit down and consider the ramifications, that there's this ongoing psychological warfare, that there's action in a world that we can't understand, they might actually come to the point where they feel they have every right, if not an actual duty, to start shooting these things down. And to begin to approach this, I think almost with that sort of sense that people, that once powerless people can have once they find some degree of agency, there's a certain bolshiness in it. That rather than sitting there, looking at the second coming of the sky gods, they can feel they can take some power control of this situation by shooting some of these down and beginning to sort of have the agenda and follow a direction that they want.
Well, that's doubtless true. And especially so if that's their default mode. I mean, if you are a hammer, everything you think is a nail. And if you are a military, especially post World War II, you're ready to fight wars. So just on the pure reflex basis, you're going to do that because that's what you've been doing. Of course, in addition to that, you're right that at the next level, they could see it as a duty and see it in those terms having reflected upon the problem. And it just continues from there. It's all that they can do. And you can see the overt military being itself splintered or fractured into more covert military branches dealing with this all the time. The reports of the black helicopters, to the extent that those are ours and actual, well, where do they come from? The harassment of UFO witnesses. I mean, there was a guy who told a story on an interview that I heard some time back. He was I think, an abductee, but he'd had some sort of contact, and he kept getting this recurring sense that somebody was in the house with him, and it wasn't necessarily an alien or anything like that. It wasn't anticipating an abduction encounter or anything, but that another human being was in the house. He just couldn't see the person. And then one day, by freak luck, in the bathroom, he was opening up like the mirror of a medicine cabinet, a kind of mirror that you move, and he saw in the reflection of the mirror from just like one particular angle a person in some sort of getup staring at him. And through one way or another, he had contacted people who were involved with cloaking technology or something like that. And the conclusion drawn was that this is a human being in the house using cloaking technology, likely available already to the US military, in the house, probably not only for surveillance, but also as a form of harassment.
Oh my God,
What?
was this guy? Was this just a straightforward abductee? Just somebody claims, middle of the night, found
Yeah, and
himself
as I
inside.
recall, it was a younger type of person who was, kind of laughing at it, and the way it wasn't somebody in their 50s who was purely terrified. The person was trying to make light of it, but also the description was quite vivid and
Right.
quite
Yeah.
clear. I don't remember anything being significant about the abduction backstory,
Right. Okay.
but it's somebody who just all of a sudden was subjected to this type of harassment. And there are other cases like that. Now, just think of the I don't know, just the sheer number of human horrors now that have been introduced because of UFO contact and the way we've reacted to it. I mean, the fact that now in human history, it can be said that you've got human beings in cloaking technology um, standing next to and harassing other human beings in their homes. I mean, that didn't happen 400 years ago. So I look at it from that perspective, at least partly, that, that just the awfulness, the number of awful things that have happened that are now part of human collective memory, and the shit that we're doing to ourselves, or the harassment of the abductees and so on, even if it's in pursuit of duty or the basic fearfulness that comes with the desire to protect oneself, it can't be justified in the end. It's the
Yeah.
horribles multiply.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was interesting earlier on. We were talking about spies, and I did think of. I think he had been with the CIA. Someone coming forward, and he was talking about assassinations and wet work and those sort of actions. And he just spoke about it from from the impact it had on the actual operatives themselves. And he said these people were devastated by it. It's not some sort of Bourne movie or James Bond like actions. These were often just cold blooded murders. He said they just exact an enormous toll on the murderers.
I don't doubt it.
Yeah, and I think too is that you know what everyone would think about the overall doctrine of karma. I just think within the U.S. in particular, there just seems there will have been such an accumulation of this sort of, to sound like a hippie, but just sheer negative energy. around some of these institutions, that you'd have to expect it to spill out in spectacularly ugly ways for the society at large. Um, I think for me, the historical analogy that sits best is that I think the US will come to sort of a Weimar moment, or there will be, whether it's your next administration, it becomes your Weimar America. What I'm necessarily suffering is sort of a world war defeat, but you can imagine another global financial crisis whose effects are far more reaching because government is fundamentally just as without the capacity to deal with another one. You could see someone like Hillary Clinton sitting there in the White House and given the vagaries of the Electoral College without a majority of the popular vote, and she's got a huge number of growing number of unemployed people, debt and the like, large numbers of men with military experience. You can imagine the militias being your version of the Freikorps. This sort of very ugly, if you like, this sort of netherworld between one political dispensation and a far uglier but firmer one to come. Is sort of my sense of how it plays out. And I just think too that with all this hidden action, all these hidden wars, is that there's a lot of experience in these directions. There's a lot of experience with these things, a lot of experience with violence, a lot of familiarity with violence and conspiracy against democracy. Just like in the Weimar Republic, to contend with former soldiers who only knew authoritarian conditions, who only understood authoritarian political structures. And you have 101 groups, as with the Free Corps, who took it upon themselves to execute political positions as they saw fit. So you have to wonder in the US, you have all these various demographic groups and political sympathies, and overlaid on top of that are dozens of various organizations with vast experience in murder and the like. And just have to think the US is going to face a very ugly phase of just an
I fully
ugly,
agree. I mean, whatever
ugly
scenario you
phase.
pose, I think it'll be even worse. I mean, no one can out-negative me when it comes to the US. That's one of the reasons why I got the hell out. It's
Yeah,
game over. And I think any country, when it embarks on empire, ends up destroyed. I think the UK today, which people regard, they regard as kind of a neutral, harmless country at this point, kind of like, lackey to the US. But I think if you scratch the surface underneath in the UK, there's a lot of ugliness from the class structure, which itself was just the product of empire. You have this rampant pedophilia going on that they're always trying to cover up today. You know, you've got at the highest levels of office, you've got pedophilia everywhere, and they're still trying to do, like, point the spotlight onto entertainment figures like Jimmy Savile and anybody who's kind of vaguely similar in the public mind. Those guys are the ones getting arrested, but the political figures, nah.
yeah,
But
yeah.
obviously they're guilty.
Hmm.
There's a lot of just pure ugliness there, and I think it's the result of empire. If there's any kind of moral teleology in history, I think when one nation or country embarks on this quest for supremacy and exploits and loots and takes over, the ugliness that is created in just the same way you're talking about the assassins, or we look at soldiers who have to kill hundreds of people and come back and they're scarred forever. The country is a collection of individuals. In order to perpetuate that dominance, they become ugly in all sorts of unspeakable ways. And you see it in the US today, and it will continue. It'll get uglier and uglier and uglier. And there's no positive outcome for them. The country's finished.
Well, I'd say two things to what you said. Is one, about the UK, as a seasoned observer of the British, well, what I would say is I'd agree with you is that what's true of the UK, I think is true of other European countries, is that they do have a tribal heart that still beats, and I think given the right conditions, there will be I think there'd be something of a reckoning between the sort of the host populations and the recent immigrants. I don't think any European country has really successfully managed multiculturalism or multiracialism, probably for want of leadership. But you can get a temper for the English if you ever go watch the English watch football. I mean, in terms of just ugly emotions, it's. I mean, yeah, I think a couple of months ago I watched a friend of mine's from London. And we watched West Ham versus Bolton, somebody. Well, West Ham are they're a London team, largely backed by Essex residents now, those who are the white flight from London, and I tell you, it was just the emotions, just the collective malice, collective aggression. You've 300 idiots in a suburb in Perth swearing at the referee and calling him a fucking wanker and the like, and it's ridiculous. But there is, that boneheaded savagery is right there. And I can't remember who said, I read it somewhere, but that if there's a gun in a room at the start of the play, by the final act it will have fired. It's something like this, and that's something in Europe, in England, in Britain, that'll still play out. Just I think Europeans, in a fundamental sense, haven't really learned the lessons of history or don't care to. As for the US and its empire, well, you can always look forward to a goal. You might get lucky. You might get lucky. Someone who's just intelligent enough just to look at the balance sheet and see that the costs outweigh the benefits and just in some way pull the pin.
Well, I don't see it happening, unfortunately. I think it'll be a total collapse because the US, because it's a kind of economic nexus for the global economy, and in a way, the imperialism that it executes constantly it's an operation of that economy. It is uniquely disconnected from any kind of national interest. It serves elites that are not even American anymore. They're international elites. So the only way that you would have a government with official power behaving in a way that, in recognizing a national interest exists in bringing the troops home and that sort of thing, would be only after such a collapse that the elites abandoned the U.S., in which case there'd be no more money for the troops anyway, so it would be kind of like a de facto, it'd be, it would happen no matter what.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure if I agree that the American people don't benefit from empire. I think the American
No,
people
they do, but it's sort of a side effect. I mean, local police forces are being equipped with all sorts of combat weapons and tanks today as a result of these imperialist wars. So they benefit. Every asshole who draws a paycheck, from the weapons manufacturer to the dealer to the secretaries in the defense establishment, the think tanks, the government think tanks, the people who come out of universities who go work and they try to optimize the supply lines. All those people benefit. So I fully concur with that. But the point is that it's not undertaken for their benefit.
no. Well, no, but I think the benefit lies in the value, in the strength of the US dollar that results from American imperialism. The use and demand for the dollar globally is itself the biggest payoff for imperialism. For instance, if the US dollar were to have in value, American standards of living would collapse. How many Americans could actually drive their car? How many could feed themselves? So there is enormous payoff in empire. I think, and I think for that reason, then, to the idea of the goal is a bit silly. You're never going to produce anyone who actually thinks, well, really what we need to do is step away from dominating the globe and enter into some sort of concert of power. That's not going to happen. I think the empire is going to hang on to the bitter end, with ever more or less intelligent compromises with challenges to that position. You sort of see that playing out with this Ukrainian crisis. The US seems to be blowing hot and cold as to the line it wants to take with Moscow. Right now, it seems to be willing to negotiate. So it seems to be stepping away from that conflict. But it's as to America's general fate. Well, there are two things. There's one, its overall experience will be determined by the changes in the environment that are expected. But also then there's this hidden thing that I think is there. I think there is an understanding of things that are to come, which we don't know of, that it's inspires, drives a lot of secrecy that we were talking about earlier on. But that's a sort of an unknowable. But I do notice that it does tend to be brought up a fair amount by the likes of Greer and other contactees and abductees. I just watched a clip from the John Mack's investigation of the aerial school sighting in Zimbabwe, and this clip was just one of the most extraordinarily powerful pieces of evidence I've come across. And this is she must be 4 or 5, black or colored girl. And Mac is asking her, so what did the man say to you? And she's doing her best. And she's telling me he didn't say anything. It was just a feeling. He put ideas in me. And she's saying that this man told her, we're destroying the world. We're destroying the environment. We're destroying the forest, reducing the oxygen content. It's not good. And you mean it's that sort of those conditions, or these developments, which will determine America's fate. And we're all going to hang together in that way.
Environmental collapse may well doom the U.S. and all sorts of other countries. When it comes to the way empire operates, I guess I look at it through a different set of facts. The agreements being negotiated right now, the Pacific trade agreements, the Atlantic trade agreements, all seem nothing more than an attempt to establish corporate sovereignty as a new form of life. Now that you would think would be a direct I mean, you're completely sacrificing your own self-interest, your national self-interest, if you are a government like the U.S. and you want to give up your sovereignty to corporations. If you view yourself as the most powerful government currently in the world, why would you want to cede power to organizations, corporations over which you have no control? Well, you have to ask the question. The answer presents itself because that is the purpose of the U.S. government today and many national governments. They exist in order to deliver more power and wealth to small groups, corporations, individuals, and so on. So when it comes to the U.S. giving up its empire and so on, you can see it happening only at that precise moment when the elites no longer benefit from the empire. Now, the value of the dollar has been declining for probably decades now, 30, 40, 50 years. And compared to back then, the dollar today will get you nothing. But even though the standards of living have declined, they haven't declined as completely as the scenario that you discussed, simply because the U.S. can pressure other countries to devalue their own currency, which they've done. So if the U.S. dollar goes down, well, that's okay if we make everyone else's currency go down at the same time. It's interesting if you look at the history of U.S. imperialism. I don't know if we've ever discussed this before or not, but there was something quite fascinating that came out with a study done by a guy named Michael Hudson, who's a professor, and the book is called Super Imperialism.
Yeah.
He did an economic history of the U.S. from maybe around the time of the First World War and presented it in stages. And he established that by the 70s, there was a mechanism in place, thanks to leaving the gold standard when Nixon went through he put the country through so-called Nixon shock, that the U.S. government could effectively run itself into infinite debt. And even though they didn't fully realize this at the time, this is the whole basis for American imperialism today. This is how they can be so completely in debt and yet afford this high-tech military to go around the world on corporate adventures. Because when they stopped, so, other countries through balance of trade will build up dollars. And in the old days, in order to get rid of their dollars, they would go to the U.S. and say, give us the equivalent in gold. Well, with Nixon, that process ceased. So the only thing these other countries could do with their American dollars was buy, for example, treasury bonds. So you exchange paper for paper. It was an ingenious closure of, or an inversion of the economic system, because when the U.S. decided to go that route, all of these trade imbalances that resulted in all of these dollars being held by foreign banks, those dollars could only obtain any value at all if those foreign banks and foreign countries basically gave the dollars back to the U.S. and bought treasury bonds, like an IOU.
Yep.
And so the U.S. became like this vacuum, this vortex for the entire financial system, where it would absorb the wealth generated by all these other countries, and it would support, the U.S. standard of living, and basically just export IOUs and so on. So, to large measure, all of these imperial adventures are paid for by these other countries, by Europe, China.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's a question of whether the dog is wagging the tail or the tail is wagging the dog. The dollar, the fact that it's weak and that it's in this weird state, is what enables the imperial adventures, although it's also true that the imperial adventures are designed to protect the dollar as a world's reserve currency, which is factored into all that. So it's this self-regulating, self-supporting system that no one can break.
Yeah, I think I came across an interview with Hudson, and something that immediately impressed me about him was that he was able to, or he seems to have an analyst that takes into account a lot of pertinent facts and just flat out ignored in an awful lot of discussion about American foreign policy and American military action in the world. And in particular, and especially the significance of coming off the gold standard and the recycling of the dollar reserves, and for example the petrodollar, and then how that impacted on foreign policy in the Middle East. And he seemed to have, if you weigh, like almost a unified theory of American imperialism, that he could account well for some of the supposed inconsistencies there.
If you think there's any justice in history, I wrote an essay where I traced, using his analysis, all of American imperialism that we know it to be today from the Kennedy assassination. When they decided to kill Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, in effect, in my analysis, had to give them the Vietnam War as a type of compensation, because the most plausible political explanation for the murder of JFK, I mean, there were several things that went into it, but the military was dominated by war hawks. They wanted the first strike option. They actually wanted to go after the Soviets with a first nuclear strike. They thought it was a winnable nuclear war. Again and again and again, Kennedy was an obstacle to these war hawks engaging in all sorts of offensive measures against the Soviet Union. These guys despised Kennedy because he was young. They thought he was inexperienced. He was soft. You had these crises like the Bay of Pigs and the missile crisis and so on, themselves complicated events. But they really despised this guy, and they thought he was endangering the survival of the country. They, in this interpretation, killed Kennedy, and they used this supposedly pro-Cuban Oswald as the patsy, because what they wanted was a land invasion of Cuba. And that's why they used the patsy they did, because they thought that if you use a pro-Cuban leftist as the assassin, that the American people would instantly be screaming bloody murder and want Castro's head. And then if they did the land invasion of Cuba, they'd not only get Cuba, but if they provoked the war with the Soviets, they could win that with acceptable losses. Fortunately, what happened was a counter-conspiracy seemed to emerge between Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover. And sensing in that same way that all these politicos are paranoid, they knew that the whole thing was fishy, and they sensed where it was coming from. They immediately set out to quash the Castro angle and replace it with the lone nut angle, which is what we have today. He was a nobody. He was somebody who wanted fame. He killed Kennedy because he was just this cowardly nobody, and Kennedy was a god. So in the public imagination, nobody remembers that he was pro-Cuban, and still fewer, I mean, nobody thinks that Castro put him up to it. Instead, they have this myth, this legend of Oswald as a disgruntled loner, the lone wolf, which is what they use again and again for everybody. But anyway, so they deal with assassination that way. Johnson tells Earl Warren, who led the Kangaroo Court, the so-called Warren Commission, that if they didn't tie this thing up quickly, that there'd be 40 million casualties. In other words, a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. So Warren did what he was supposed to do. Oswald was a lone gunman because he was nuts. But you still had these bloodthirsty hawks in the Pentagon. So Johnson gave him Vietnam. Go at it, he said. Here you go. And not because he was some sort of wise sage who cared about his country and made some deft political maneuver. He himself was a savage, and there were big bucks to be made. He made a ton on stocks and everything else. But that's what happened. Now, when the U.S. went into Vietnam, it was still a conventional economy, and it ran itself massively into debt. That debt from the Vietnam War is what led directly to the Nixon shock, where Nixon said, well, hey, we can't pay you back with gold anymore. Sorry, all our gold's gone. But we'll give you these pieces of paper that say we'll pay you later. And then almost the unplanned consequence of that was that now they never had to pay anybody back. So they could go to war anytime they wanted to, which is what we've seen more and more and more. So if there's justice in history, again, you can say, you look at the Kennedy assassination, that's when America assassinated itself. It was done after that.
Yeah, it's, I find it interesting in talking to you that you seem so, I don't want to use the word fatalistic, because that almost supposes that what you're saying is intellectually invalid in some way, but really you are quite pessimistic about America's prospects. If you look in European history, let me put it this way: you see in German history or French history, maybe not so much in British history, but you see, political orders and various foreign policy adventures leading to disaster. But what you see again and again is recovery. You see profound recovery can occur. Like in Germany's history or Prussia's history, that had great success in the 18th century, and then it suffered crippling defeats against Napoleon, recovered with wars of liberation. This was the 19th century again, went through a long process of reform, modernization, succeeded in the wars of unification, catastrophic defeat in the First World War, very real recovery during Weimar, which was aborted with the Nazis, overwhelming defeat in the Second World War, but then you have the recovery of the Federal Republic. It's this sort of grand arc. You can see all sorts of decline, fall, recovery. You see the same with France. Since the revolution, we're now looking at 5 republics and 3 empires. This is a country that's sort of reissued and rebranded itself or relaunched itself again and again and again. And I'd look at the US and think, well, it has been extraordinarily stable for so long. You still have the one republic. You have a constitution now that's so old, it's reached the position of being some sort of religious relic, seemingly for some of your people. But that's not at all to say that a second American republic can't be found, or that the United States cannot wholly rejuvenate itself. I know maybe from a certain perspective, your hopes for future national rejuvenation would be dim. But you do have in the US, you have very, very studied practitioners of imperialism within your armies, within your military and your intelligence services. And you think within that permanent government, within the deep state, there are groups who are capable of at least analyzing very clearly America's malaise and its problems, and acting in a way that could bring about that rejuvenation, bring about that recovery. I do take the point that the US in a way is still a long way gone past the point of being an actual coherent nation state, and now is some sort of global imperial instrument, or just this sort of the plaything, if you like, of the global elite. And it's as evidenced by this TPP. but nonetheless, it's I would sort of bring to it that sort of confidence that nations can recover, Phoenix line. Irregardless of what that environmental context may be that we spoke about earlier on. But I was just wondering that, why you wouldn't share maybe that similar confidence and optimism.
Well, it depends on what you say is being reborn. If you use the example of France, you mentioned the number of empires and republics, but does that matter? I mean, in saying that something is gone is not necessarily to say that it's completely destroyed. I mean, we're not talking about, the Aztecs where the population's wiped out necessarily. When it comes to the U.S., what I associate with the U.S. and see as valuable in what it's provided to the world was a certain kind of special vibrancy and, thriving that came with here and there the experience of freedom from political tyranny. Not throughout the entire history of the U.S., but here and there. If you look at simply the development, the appearance of jazz music, that was, world historically, absolutely unique. I mean, what we call classical music is really, 500 smaller traditions. But to the extent that there is a thing called classical music, you had in the United States emerge this very unique but equally substantial form of music. Now, if you look at a lot of these countries that have spent themselves, and that's how I view them as spent. What have they contributed to culture? These orgies of violence that have gone on in Europe. These countries today, like France and Italy, the UK even, you might put down their limitations to size and so on. I don't think that's necessarily the case or the reason, because if you look at the population of the US, maybe 1910, it could well be the population in the UK today. I don't know. But population doesn't necessarily equal cultural vibrancy. What are these European countries contributing today to culture? I think very little. I think they haven't contributed anything in a long time. But that's also true of the US. The difference, though, is that the European countries seem to me to be largely on life support. They just exist. They perpetuate themselves. You look at a country like Italy, there's a lot of human ugliness in the people at large. Maybe that goes back to imperial pretensions. But, the country muddles along. Nothing is efficient. It's just, it is what it is, but it doesn't produce anything. Yeah, okay, fine. There's a film every now and then or something, but everyone's making films. What is the brand new, unique cultural form that in Italy or France or the UK is producing? Nothing. Now, the US, what is it doing that's new? And more, perhaps the majority of what it creates today that's new in world historical terms is, in my opinion, awfulness. I mean, the innovation continues at a fast pace in the US, but it's all in the direction of evil. Whether it's putting, 30% of your kids under the age of 10 on psychotropic drugs, whether it's, Jesus Christ, I mean, unprecedented types of brutality, serial murder, the horrors, the ugliness in film and culture. So the innovation is all in a negative direction in the US, it seems to me. And these little small, bright, shiny compensations that people point to, like, oh, the internet, oh, my iPhone, even that ultimately I think will end in just a complete ugly catastrophe. The internet, for example, if you go back and you look at some of the web pages, which I had a chance to do recently, that existed, like 1998. If you looked at what the internet was then, it was free, but it had a totally different feel to it. It felt like it was pure opportunity. There were no limits. Even though by today's standard, everything was primitive technically. Today, the internet, although people don't want to recognize it, in part because it's a work in progress, it's simply a corporate media experience. Even a few years ago, you could go onto forums on websites, paranormal forums, and people would register. I mean, Unknown Country used to have one, for Christ's sake, before they let that die. Countless websites had forums. To a man, they're all gone. From what I see today, the ones I used to go to, there's no activity that hasn't been in 2 years. Why? Everyone's migrated to Facebook. Well, what is
Yeah.
Facebook? It's just a corporate managed media experience. And, these tablets and these small devices that they have explicitly designed to be media delivery devices. Well, what kind of media do you suppose you're going to get? Corporate media. So on the one hand, you have a total migration of the public sphere, which used to be, like we were discussing previously, civic organizations, social events, nightclubs, for Christ's sake. You have a total migration of the public sphere into the virtual. On the other hand, you have the increasing structuring and control of that virtual public space by corporations who have no interest other than the corporate. Steal your information, force you to do things this way, not that way, so on and so forth. It's a disaster. So then what are these great things that are being produced? Well, you look at the people and the way the people continue to degrade the intelligence. It's a post-literate country in the U.S. Not only are they basically only functionally literate, but their brains are being rewired to obey these media stimuli. They don't have the attention to read a book, to follow the written word, line after line after line after line. It's too much. It makes the heads ache. So the way I come at it is I recognize that when we try to understand our world, there are basically two axes that come into play. There's the moral and there's the causal. And it's an innovation in human civilization that the two are even connected at all. So when I said earlier, if there's any justice in history, the fact is that, the people who killed Kennedy to quote unquote save the country murdered the country. Well, that in itself, by associating the purely causal or historical with some sort of moral purpose, that notion didn't always exist in human beings. I think only in the last several thousand years has it emerged with the written word and civilization and so on. But anyway, it's a construct. That's my point. Nevertheless, as much as we like to associate the two, and as much as we like to say, well, your immoral act, your badly intentioned act produced this negative causal outcome, the fact is that the two can be divorced. And the trick is to look at things in causal terms as much as possible. And if you look at simply a causal environment, and I look at the U.S. as a causal environment, I say what trends are going positive and will save us, and what trends are going negative and will doom us. And I don't see positive. Not certainly enough positive to make any kind of impact.
Well, yeah. I mean, what about the changing demographics of the U.S.? I mean, you more and more Asian migration. I mean, they're populating all your better universities apparently, or large more and more Asian students there. Do you not think that demographic alone, 30, 40 million people or whatever it may be, it in itself will generate an impact comparable to, say, the impact Jews had upon the U.S., upon 20th century America? Out of all proportion to their number, they themselves can be a sort of a cultural and intellectual regenerative force.
If I consider these populations and what I know of them, what they're doing in universities, like Chinese students, Indian students, and so on, I see them motivated purely by a desire to improve economically. Some of them obviously return home with the skills they've acquired, but many stay because the quality of life is better in the U.S. But I don't think they have that kind of special magic that the Jewish populations had when they came, where they're inside the culture and outside the culture, but they whatever it is that they do, whatever they contribute, is unique. I don't really see that happening much.
Okay.
The racial composition of the United States is a double-edged sword. What you were talking about before, I agree with when it comes to the European countries. Each nation state is basically historically a reflection of a certain tribalism, right? French tribes, the Italian tribes. That's one of the reasons why they can never get their shit together and become truly post-racial, because their experience has been propelled by the tribal dynamic for too long. The U.S., it's been different because, at least for the first part of the history, you had a lot of people coming in who maintained their kind of tribal integrity, but because in those days the concepts associated with the republic were so abstract, and because the country was big enough that you could go out somewhere and generally be left alone, it kind of worked, even though some tribes were completely mistreated. If you look at the black slaves, obviously that was a tribe that was not allowed to thrive. But a lot of the European ones, even despite differences and language differences, they came over and they integrated, they thrived. So the US, in one regard, has one foot in a kind of post-racial getting along situation from the beginning. But on the other hand, the fact that there is no tribal identity means there are no coordinates of shared experience. What's the
Right.
common frame of reference you're going to have with your neighbor? Nobody
Yeah.
has any frame of reference to anybody now. And that's been caused and amplified by the proliferation of technology.
Yep.
And so when you talk about social cohesion, when disaster strikes, what's going to happen? Well, it could be even worse than in some of these European countries where they have this, tribal mentality. It's hard to say.
Well, I mean, this is it. I mean, this is, you're getting into difficult waters because I think it was Robert Putnam who wrote that. We talked about bowling alone. He wrote that in the early 90s. He later did a survey on social trust. I don't know whether he wrote a book, but all I remember was just coming across an interview he did where he talked about social trust, and he said he was so disturbed by the findings that he suppressed them for some years. He wouldn't publish them, which sort of says a lot in itself. But he basically discovered, he said that the ethnic diversity of a community was inversely related to the level of social trust, which in a way, on first glance, my reaction was that just goes to show you why sociologists are such a fucking joke. That you can conduct a survey, you conduct a study to find out the blisteringly obvious. But on the other hand, it does point to sort of strangely the self-defeating nature of progressive infatuation with multiculturalism. That it sort of gives rise to a society of people who are looking at each other who have next to nothing in common, and who themselves give up any sort of faith in progressive politics. In a European context, you can see this very clearly. It now seems that the purpose of many European governments, or a core function, is to settle as many non-European peoples within their jurisdiction as possible, as seamlessly as possible, which is, to having actually experienced it, to have gone from, in Ireland, which was wholly Irish when I was growing up, until I think my late teens, large-scale inward migration began. You could actually see this quite dramatically. You could see a dramatic change in the population of the country, and this coincided with a period of tremendous economic prosperity. So people were essentially nonplussed. They just ignored it. Life was good and they got on with it. But ultimately, what I think there is that there's great injury to the body politic, in that now you're looking at a society when many people, they're asked to consider, social programs. They're basically seeing it through a particular set of glasses. They're seeing it from a particular vantage point, which is they're asking themselves, well, why should I pay more tax for these people? Or, really, should we not look after these people rather than those people? And it just leads to this ugliness. And then on top of that, you're stuck with ethnic minorities who typically, it would seem, end up with this belligerent self-pity and anger about their position within a failing capitalist society. Well, one of the more interesting sort of stories I came across was there was some experiment in the US a couple of years ago where they painted one family, a black family, white, and a white family black. They did this with makeup and the rest. It was quite convincing. What the white family found was they couldn't believe the amount of racism they experienced as blacks. What the black people found was they couldn't believe how hard life was for whites. A lot of stuff they assumed was racism is just the tough shit of capitalism. And so this is sort of the dynamic European countries have set themselves up for. Cities full with people who, they don't want to be French. They're never going to be French. But then they're never going to be able to contribute. They just can't contribute anything to, post-industrial economies. And this is something I think it will sort of play out in a sort of honestly a South African way. There will be, an apartheid and a separateness, and I mean this in the best sort of way. It's just that you will have more and more devolved local government, and certain peoples will live together and certain peoples will live apart. At a later point in human history, I think that our current multiracial, multicultural experiment will be seen much more negatively than it is now.